fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast third season. All my loyal listeners, thank you for your continued support. It's an amazing episode because Morgan Hampton boards the mothership to discuss Sons of Star Trek from IDW. Now come on board as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Morgan. Thank you so much for coming to Versus Stars podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great.
Totally my pleasure. So I always start off with a question of inspiration. So what inspired your love for comics and who your earliest influences?
Oh, that's a great question. My love for comics started, I must have been 7 or 8. My dad had a bunch of comics in his basement. There were these, it was like an offshoot, or not an offshoot, an alternate universe of DC Comics called Tangent Comics. I don't know if you remember that. And
Oh,
it was kind of,
yeah.
it was like my first like introduction to like the multiverse in comics. Because I was familiar with like Batman and Superman from growing up watching a TV show, but like in the comic books, like to see that like there were alternate versions of these characters, like really like opened up my mind to the possibilities. So I'd say that was an early inspiration of just like getting into the medium of comics. I thought that was so cool. And then inspiration like of like creators and stuff, definitely Dwayne McDuffie with Milestone and back in those days and even like Milestone today, like what they're doing with those comics as well. Like I really am a big fan of like authentic storytelling. And Milestone, kind of like being at the forefront of that and being ahead of its time was really inspiring to see as well.
Oh, like I said, big fan of Static Shock. I was collecting that back in the day. I've been buying it for a long time. And Tangent, if I remember correctly, that's the one with there's a woman Green Lantern. I think she holds like a staff and the lantern like hanging from the staff.
Yeah,
I do know my
yeah.
Tangent. Like I said, it was a very good comic. I remember. I think they brought the character back a couple times in the main country, but I can't remember
Yeah.
what that was. So you went from fan to now you're a writer. You're now writing Sons of Star Trek from IDW. So how do you get involved with the project?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting story of just like, they always tell you like everything's about connections and stuff like that. I was just starting out a couple years ago, entering the industry. I did the Milestone Initiative at DC Comics, which is like a talent development program. And I was just trying to find my bearings in this industry. And I met Jackson Lansing at San Diego Comic 2020. We found out we both live in the same like area, and we started hanging out. Him, and one of my friends, Dorado, who was also in the Milestone Initiative. And it was right when his Star Trek line was starting at IDW, and I congratulated him because I was a big Star Trek fan. And I was like, "You're living the dream. You're writing Cisco, all this cool stuff." And he was like, "Look, like these comics have been successful. Like if we end up doing some spin-off books, I'll put your name in the hat for one of them." And I thought he was just being nice, being a cool guy or whatever. I didn't think anything would come out of it. And sure enough, a couple months go by and he calls me like out of the blue and he was like, "Remember I told you we're going to be spinning off in some books? I put your name up for one of those books." And I was like, "What? That's insane. Thank you so much." And I talked with Heather. She asked me to pitch on it. And then the rest is history.
So the interesting about not only writing for Star Trek from IDW, but writing Star Trek at all, is that
Yeah.
you only have to deal with about 50 years of continuity, give or take, right? I mean,
Yeah.
only. Um, Actually, it's almost 60 years now. It's probably closer to 60 years now, because
Yeah.
1967, 68 from now. Yeah, it's a very big math number, and I don't have the math in my head. But it's been a long run for a long time. But you also
Yeah.
have novelizations, multiple series of four, seven, eight series to keep track of.
Yeah.
The Star Trek comic books in IDW, Star Trek Defiant comic books of IDW. How long did it take you to dive into this continuity and keep
Yeah.
and to know what you're doing? Because what you're doing, and we'll get into a little bit later, there's a lot of continuity Easter eggs in that
Yeah.
story. So how long did it take you to fully deep dive into this whole universe?
Well, it helped that I was already a big fan.
Okay.
I kind of grew up more of a Star Wars guy.
Yeah.
Um, but I think probably my introduction to the Star Trek industry, or not industry, franchise was the J.J. Abrams movies, and I just kind of watched those as like a casual fan. But during COVID, when I was at home with nothing to do, this was before I was a professional comic book writer. I was just doing it to do it. I watched the entirety of the franchise, like
Nice.
original series, animated, the animated shows. I think at that time Picard had just started, like everything. I watched everything over the course of like 7 months. So I became really soaked into this franchise. And so when I got this opportunity, I already had a bunch of like ideas on what I could do. And then when it comes from the comics, like yeah, I'd been reading Jackson and Collins comic as well. And I think when they brought me on, it was still fairly new. So I think I'd only had to read maybe 6 or 7 issues, and then they gave me some insight on what like the Day of Blood stuff was. So I read like the outlines of that before it came out to help me kind of inform what my pitches were going to be. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it is just like with the continuity stuff, what you don't know, like your editor helps you with, keeps you in track with all that. And then like Paramount, who owns like the license for Star Trek, like stuff has to go through them as well. So like if you do mess something up continuity wise, like there's a lot of checks and balances to make sure that you get everything right.
You know, it's kind of funny. Growing up, I was more of a Star Wars fan. I mean, my father was a huge Star Trek fan, and then but I was more of a Star Wars fan.
Mhm.
You know, I read all the EU books. You know, the ones that are now called EU. Back in the day, they're just called the good novels.
Yeah.
And then as I got older, I moved into Star Trek more. To be some Star Wars fans, as I became more of an adult, I got into
Yeah.
Star Trek fan. So it's kind of interesting. What do you think? I know you said the movies, but what transition do you think more away from Star Wars into Star Trek? Because they are, for
Yeah.
people who don't know, but they are significantly different properties, even though they both have star and they're both dealing in space.
Yeah. Well, I'd say just first off, like I'm still a big Star Wars fan. I know growing up, like you had to pick a side. I think you can be both nowadays, and I definitely am both. But yeah, I think what kind of made me gravitate towards it as I got older, I'll mention my dad again. He was always getting on me because he's a big Star Trek fan. And like he tells me stories of like watching me when I was a kid when he'd be watching reruns of like the Next Generation and stuff. So just kind of having that relationship with him kind of helped me get into Star Trek because it was something else we could talk about. And then I think the big difference and what's drawn me more towards it now as I've gotten older and just more mature as a person is like, Star Trek as a franchise is always about at its heart looking at the good in humanity and the good in what we could do and should do as a species. And I think that's what differs it with Star Wars. Star Wars is, technically a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And they're humans, but they're not humans in the way that we are.
Hmm.
And with Star Trek, like they're humans that we hope to be, right? In the next couple hundred years, that we kind of want to ingratiate ourselves with the values of that show as we kind of like trek, pun intended, into the future that we're trying to forge. So yeah.
Now, like I said, you do some deep cuts in your series.
Yeah.
The primary characters, well, one of the primary characters is in himself a deep cut. I think he only shows up once in continuity, which is the Q Junior, or technically,
Mhm.
I think his name is still Q because they're all named Q, but he's like the
Yeah.
Q's, the main Q's that we know of, son, Q Junior.
Yes.
And I think he only
Yeah.
shows up in one episode of Star Trek Voyager, if memory serves.
Yes.
So he brings over to an alternate universe, Jake Sisko from Deep Space Nine, Nog from Deep Space Nine, and Worf's son Alexander from both Next Generation and technically Deep Space Nine because he shows up in that one. And like I said, you go to the alternate reality. So, what was about these characters that were important to you? How deep of a dive was finding Q Junior and all this? Were you just kind of like holding on to that idea, like somewhere in the back of your head that you wanted to use at some point?
Yeah. So I think going into this, it was going into this book, it was half they had somewhat of an idea of what they wanted to do and half of a pitch from me. So I knew going in that they wanted to do something with like Jake and Alexander, specifically spinning out of the Day of Blood event. And I'm like, that's perfect for me because I'm a big Jake Sisko fan. I think his relationship with Sisko matches me and my dad's relationship. My dad was a Marine and I didn't follow in his footsteps. I became a writer just like Jake didn't go to Starfleet and became a writer. So I was on board because of that alone. So I knew it was going to be about like kids of these like big Star Trek figures and coming out of Day of Blood and how they're going to be reconciling with that. So I formed my pitch around just like daddy issues in space, essentially, right? And I knew I wanted to have Nog in it because Nog is one of my favorite characters, and I knew that the conflict that they were dealing with could have also served well if it was coming from another child of like a big Star Trek character. So the Q thing was definitely something that came out of left field for me. I was just doing research on how I can find a character that would match what I wanted to tell with this story. I also wanted to cheat a little bit and tell a Starfleet story, which is why it's in an alternate universe. Because I know Jake's not in Starfleet and neither is Alexander, but I'm like, I want to be on a ship. I want to do some cool Star Trek stuff on a ship. So using Q or QJ that we like to call him was just a way to do that. And yeah, I was watching a bunch of episodes, just trying to figure out where I could find it. And then I happened upon that Voyager episode, which I'd seen before, obviously, but realizing that like, yeah, you have this Q who may be trying to like be just like his father and has to maybe learn the same lessons of the humans or organics that he's trying to teach, in terms of just like you have to forge your own path in this galaxy, you know?
Yeah, like I said, I really love the inclusion of QJ.
Yeah,
And the thing about Qs though, that they're all kind of assholes.
absolutely.
Their motives are not always clear, nor are they always honest about the motives that they do have,
Yeah.
because at least the Q that we're most familiar with, and but all the Q that we have been introduced to are kind of all asses on some level. So if QJ says his motives are to teach lessons to Jake, Nog, and Worf. I mean, he even refers to himself as a I think it was like a psychologist or social worker. It was one of the two.
Mhm.
In the issue, are his motives what he says they are? Are they something different? And why does he care so much about these three? Um, as opposed to maybe I know Q father is always interested in Picard, and Picard obviously has had his kids, and we find out story. So why is his specific interest these three?
Yeah. Without spoiling too much, I'd say he thinks his motives are sincere. But I think his problem uh, at this point is that he is trying to be like his father, and maybe realizing that he needs to figure out who he is as a person, separate from his father or separate from his species, right? And I think he has a lot of pressure as being this like new Q, the first new Q in like a millennia or whatever they say on the show, that he has a lot of pressure to push the species forward, but also to push it into a different direction. And he's having a hard time reconciling what was with what he should be doing, so to speak. And I think what he sees with these specific characters is maybe not, maybe he doesn't see it like, maybe he doesn't realize he sees it, but I think what he sees is there's a kinship there, with them. They're going through a lot of the similar problems, the growing pains that he's going through, even though time moves differently for a Q, but he is the youngest of his kind, and he doesn't really have anybody that he can relate to in his species right now. And he sees a lot of the same things that these three characters, the growing pains, so to speak, of the existential stuff that you go through when you're living in, you know, the Star Trek universe.
Yeah, because as you mentioned, every character that they're talking about, including QJ, has daddy issues on
Yeah,
some level, though to different degrees. I mean, Jake kind of, I mean, his daddy issues are that they, I mean, obviously didn't follow his father's footsteps, but they still have that nice tight bond and whatnot. And Nog didn't follow in his father's footsteps completely, but they still have a pretty decent. Alexander, let's just say that Alexander has a really shitty father.
absolutely.
I mean, I'll take equally. I like Worf. Worf is my favorite character, but Worf is kind of a shitty dad. Apparently, he didn't do such a great job with him.
Yeah,
Um, so when you're talking about with QJ, who also has his own daddy issues,
yeah,
and him trying to, I don't know, reform or rehabilitate or whatever these characters, or try to, point in a different direction, since they don't all necessarily have the same issue beyond the surface of having some sort of daddy issues.
yeah.
How do you solve three problems at once with three very vastly different individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. They don't all have daddy issues, but I think what I wanted to focus on is they all have these like existential questions that they're trying to ask themselves from within, um, just as being young adults, but also living in this crazy Star Trek universe that they live in. And Q is going through something similar aside from his own daddy issues. And I think he is trying to, you know, he popped them into a universe where they can address all their problems if they're open to it, right? So there are pathways within this alternate universe for each one of these characters to, if they accept the journey in front of them, to follow it and work on the things that QJ has recognized that they need to work on, and that they may be ignoring that they need to work on, if that makes sense.
Does QJ realize the problems that he needs to work on?
As the in the first two issues that have come out so far, absolutely not.
So given that being true, who is QJ to tell others how to fix their lives, knowing that under the surface he has some serious daddy issues as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a valid question. I think he doesn't necessarily realize that he has problems right now. I think going back to what I said before, he is struggling to figure out how to be this new version of Q. And right now, in these first two issues, he's basically doing exactly what his father is. Um, but so far, I think for him, I don't exactly remember what happens at issue two. Everything bleeds together for me. But so far, he's doing just that. He's doing exactly what his father would do. And that realization for him hasn't come yet on becoming his own person.
So at the very least, the first two issues are told from the point of view of Alexander, Worf's son Alexander. Now, Alexander once again has a very interesting history, especially after going to the events of Star Trek and Star Trek Defiance. Um, how impactful is his perspective and how we as the readers understand what's happening in the story? Because it's from his perspective. So how does
Yeah,
that
I think
change?
issue one was Jake, I
Oh,
think,
it was
right?
okay.
Yeah. At least from the narration point of view.
Yeah.
And then yeah, issue two was Alexander. Yeah, Alexander is a big one. And it's been a lot of fun to kind of like flesh out his story coming out of Day of Blood because he essentially, I won't say he's irredeemable, but like he did some things that he's got to do a lot to atone for. And he's been the one I think for me that's been really fun to explore how can we redeem him? And a lot of that comes from his willingness to accept what he has done and accept his own problems with his father and growing past that. So I think in this particular issue too, going back to what I said about QJ kind of putting that path in front of them if they so choose to accept it. He had the Klingon priest that he killed. Falcor is now on this ship, and how do you reconcile with maybe trying to push down your issues or sweep them under the rug, and now they're right in front of you, and you have to kind of like confront them. And I think that's a really important thing to see with Alexander. That's different than the other three people that are dealing with their issues. You know.
I think it's kind of interesting in how Alexander is dealing with his issues. I kind of feel like Q father needs to go meet Worf and help him deal with his issues too.
Yeah.
um, and like I said, I like so much of what you did in the series. Because some like I said, some of the deep cuts I love, you have Morn talking, which is kind of interesting because Morn never ever talks.
But
So
technically, we still haven't heard him. You know, we're just reading him, which is
that's true, that's
fun.
true. But when you're thinking about how Morn would talk, since we only ever get uh a second person's account of what Morn.
Yeah.
So how did you go about giving Morn, who's you never actually ever hear utter any lines?
Yeah.
Like, was there even was there even a discussion with Paramount or Heather to be like, hey, is it okay if Morn talks, or was it just like whatever, Morn is gonna talk?
Yeah, I put it in I had like a pitch like crew manifest when I pitched the characters that I wanted on the USS Avery. And when I put him on there, I put that in there that he would be talking and they did not object, which was cool. I think honestly all the characters that are on the USS Avery, like I was swinging for the fences and like sure enough like they didn't like bump on any of them, which was
Hmm.
crazy. I was trying to emulate what Jackson and Colin and Chris do in their respective books of just kind of like plucking from different parts of the
Hmm.
universe and then having this opportunity to be an alternate universe too. I was like, I could even go further with this with like Ducat as the captain
Hmm.
and like Tuvix and all that. Like, yeah, I thought they were gonna for sure be like, no, you can't do any of this, but they let me do it. And then yeah, so yeah, I put in the pitch document that he would be talking, and they said that that was funny, and they didn't bump on it, and they didn't. There was no conversation on how he would talk. I just know from the show from Deep Space Nine, they're always saying how he was so talkative. So I tried to, implement him being long-winded whenever I could, as well.
I like the crew likes it. Captain Ducat is an interesting inclusion. What I mean, obviously he's an alternate reality Ducat, so whatever experiences he's had are not the same as Gold Ducat in Deep Space Nine. But it's kind of interesting, at least on some level, he's a pretty good captain.
Yeah.
Um, what were your thoughts on creating a captain version of him? Is it that he is such a different Ducat, or if you take the Ducat as we know and put him in that separate Starfleet or whatever, he would have been this man.
Yeah, I think what I wanted to explore, it all starts with character. I wanted to give something for Jake to confront.
Yeah.
Because for all intents and purposes, from Jake's perspective, this is the man that's responsible for his father's like I'll say ascension, but from his perspective, like death, right? Until he came back. And to now have to take orders from someone who shares that face, for Jake, it doesn't really matter what his background is. It's this is the man that's responsible for a lot of my issues. And then what I wanted to explore with Ducat is like, yeah, that maybe under different circumstances, he would have become a different person. And I think with I don't know how much of this is in the book that ended up being explained. But like the Breen have been at war with the Federation for quite a long time, to the point that like Cardassia never became this like war torn, not even war torn. What's the word I want to use? Like dominating type of a planet because they were always almost on the defensive. So what is that when you flip that on his head? What kind of man is Ducat? And I always felt like as much of a piece of shit that he was for his people, he was a leader. And
Mm.
I wanted to explore what that would look like just in a different lens and fighting for a different cause, so
Yeah,
to
I
speak.
do. I do like your point. He was a loyal piece of shit.
Yeah.
I mean, that part is true. I mean, even when he was fighting against, even when he was joining the Dominion, he had
Yeah,
his intentions in mind for his people, even though they were dumbass
absolutely.
intentions. They were the right intentions, sort of, kind
Right.
of. For him anyway. And like I said, I also love Tuvix episodes. People still are angry about Tuvix.
Yeah.
Chat rooms and stuff. They're still angry at what Janeway did. So,
Yeah.
so what motivated the inclusion of Tuvix?
Same thing, man. I'm just like that episode, watching it, I think out of the public consciousness of like watching that in real time or whatever, like just binging Voyager during COVID. I'm like, it was one of the standout episodes of the series for me. I obviously agree, like it's a very at best, a very tough conversation to have. Like, what do you do in this situation? And a lot of people, yeah, think that Janeway made the wrong decision. But yeah, I just wanted to give him more of a shine because I love that character. He's got the balance of the Talaxian and the Vulcan kind of personalities, and I knew it would be a deep cut that fans would appreciate, of the show. And yeah, I just wanted to have some more fun and give another wrinkle to that character. And to see like in this universe, I don't think we're ever going to explain exactly why he's still Tuvix, but we know that in this universe, a version of Tuvix did survive.
So, if memory serves, Jake, Nog, and Alexander don't know the Tuvix story. Is that correct?
Yeah, they don't know.
QJ may know though, right?
Yeah,
Because I figure like I kind of feel like even though the three sons are the ones with are there to solve their issues, the characters you have on that ship definitely have their serious level of issues. And Tuvix probably has bigger issues than anyone else because his very existence is the murder of two other people.
yeah, that's
So
true. I guess technically too, this was issue 2 that just came out, right?
yeah,
So Tuvix and Alexander had their moment, right?
yeah.
So I guess Alexander would kind of know as well at this point, with the mind melt situation. But yeah, I think that's a valid point you made too. I think we only have the 4 issues, so there's no room to explore more. But if I ever would get to explore this crew, this alternate universe more, that's definitely something I would love to explore with Tuvix because he's just such a rich character.
I like all the characters that you have in this comic book. Almost, well, I mean, Deep Space Nine was my favorite, but I just finished a binging of Voyager, and I thought it was a
Yeah,
great series. Another interesting thing too is talking about motivations. Going back to QJ, um, once again, memory sir, going on currently in Star Trek is issues dealing with the death of gods. There's the
right.
murder of gods, which is what Alexander was wrapped up in earlier in Day of Blood. How does this series and what QJ is trying to do connect to the idea of what's going on with Star Trek and their gods or supreme beings or whatever you want to call like what a god would be in
Yeah,
Star Trek?
yeah, I think because this takes place in an alternate universe and like it can it's almost like a time travel thing where they can pop back the moment that they left,
Hmm.
that this series technically wraps up before that the Godfell stuff that they're doing. So I don't think it really ties into it. It's more of like a spinning out of Day of Blood thing, and then after that kind of its own isolated thing.
Now, another great thing is that you're exploring the Breen,
Yeah.
which are one of the more interesting characters to come out of. I believe their Deep Space Nine was their first appearance.
Yes. Yeah.
I don't think they ever were they ever referenced in Star Trek Next Generation. I don't think so, right?
They might have been like the name dropped or something, but I don't think we
Okay.
ever saw them until Deep Space Nine.
So not only that though, but in Star Trek Discovery, we finally get to see as well the Breen underneath the helmet.
Yeah.
So how much of this were you aware of that they were going to do with the Breen when you started this series?
Yeah, it's kind of serendipitous. I had absolutely no idea. And I was just like, again, we're going to an alternate universe. I want to explore stuff that we kind of like have seen tangentially, but like have like explored a little deeper. And I bought when I got this gig, I bought the Star Trek encyclopedia that has like everything about everything from Star Trek. And I was just going through all the different alien races, and I was like, oh yeah, the Breen are cool, and they wear these like refrigeration suits, and no one knows like anything about them. And this is going to be an alternate universe, so I can kind of like play with, canon a little bit because of that. So that was really just my inspiration for that. I had absolutely no idea that Discovery was doing the Breen stuff, and I found out when I pitched it. And same thing, they didn't bump on it at all, but there was an issue. I can't spoil too much, but they basically said that the one thing we have to be wary of is showing the Breen because they were going to be in Discovery, and that's when I found out. I started writing the series, and I was like, one, that's really dope. I had no idea, but then two, we had to kind of like walk on a tightrope a little bit because we didn't want this Breen reveal to come through the comic. It has to come through the show first, so to speak.
Hmm.
But that was really it. It just happened to be serendipitous, and kind of I pitched something that they were already working on. So
Now in Deep Space Nine, they definitely insinuate that the Breen are really badass.
yeah,
Tough, badass characters, but you don't really quite see why they're so badass. You just know they're bad. I mean, there's a couple episodes that had a Breen as focus. I think there's the one with Worf and was not Jadzia Dax, the other Dax. I remember her name is
Esri.
Ezri Dax. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
But for the most part, you don't really get to see why the Breen kick ass. So, in your opinion, as the writer of this, which you really get to highlight the Breen, why do they kick
yeah,
ass?
yeah. I think again, I don't know how much of this made it into the book, but I have this like Bible I did for the series. But their motivations as a species in this universe is that I was pulling from like them wearing the refrigeration suits and no one really knowing much about their backstory. So I kind of just got to make up my own for this alternate universe. Is that they're basically their world was like a rogue planet, so to speak, which speaks to them kind of having like this frozen tundra of but then they got pulled into a solar system in the gamma quadrant, and it's like warming up their planet, so to speak, which is causing them, death and destruction, and why they have to wear these suits and all that type of stuff. And again, this is just my backstory for this alternate universe, not the main continuity. Um, so they're in war with the Federation to steal the dilithium to try to like build this engine that will basically get their planet out of the solar system so they can live in peace and harmony yet again. Um, so that to me makes them pretty badass. I like the idea of just a rogue planet, kind of like getting pulled into a solar system, and then what does that do to the ecosystem of a planet? And then you'll see in 3 and 4 some in issues 3 and 4 some really cool stuff that they're doing to kind of bring their plans to fruition that I think I'm a little biased, but I think it's a little badass too.
Now I know this is a mini series, but is it a mini series with a chance of becoming an ongoing, or this is definitely just a mini series?
I'd say it's definitely a miniseries. Yeah.
So, is there any other plans that you have with these characters moving forward after the series is over?
I mean, plans. There's nothing that I'm doing with these characters for sure. I always say on every book I do, I would love to write it forever. So like came to that and like they'd want me to come in and work on these characters again, I would do it in a heartbeat. I'd say one thing I can talk about, it was just announced today. Star Trek 500, the landmark issue for IDW, was announced. It's like an anthology that's got like 7 or 8 stories from across the franchise. I am going to be in that.
Okay.
I can't say what my story is yet, but I will be doing something with Star Trek after this series ends,
Well, now I got to
at
poke
least.
at you a little bit on this one. Feel free to dance around it, but I'm going to poke at you now since you brought it up. The final issue of Star Trek, um, Are they including Defiant as like in the numbering, by the way? Because I think they
I
didn't just
believe so. I
they just had
think
the
it's everything.
400 a little
Yeah.
while ago, right?
I think it's
Okay.
everything that's been published under IDW, that's Star Trek.
So the story that you're working on,
Yeah.
I know you can't say anything, but I'm gonna see if I can make you say something. Uh, or is it going to be in continuity, out of continuity, in universe, or out of universe?
Uh, I can't say anything. I think the one thing I will say before they put the the sniper on me, I think at this point, like all of the Star Trek comics at IDW are technically canon. So to like the larger Star Trek canon. So anything at this point until they say it's not, anything that comes out in these books is, canon. That's all. I think that's all I can say.
Okay, I'm gonna poke you one more time.
Okay.
Are we talking about writing the story that you're doing? Is it
Yeah.
single character focus, or is it dealing with an entire crew?
Can't say.
Okay, I'm gonna poke at you one last time.
All right.
The story that you're writing that neither is a crude nor necessarily individual, that is in continuity, does it tie into anything else that's coming up after that that we should be aware of?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you able to tell us what century it's going to take place in?
No. I can't. I'm sorry.
Are these characters though that we're familiar with that you're gonna be focusing on?
Yes.
All of them.
Yes.
Okay. From New Trek.
What I can tell you that isn't really a spoiler is I think it's going to be really fun and really unexpected, um, for the character for the characters that are in the story. I think it's going to be fun and unexpected. That's all I can say.
Okay, fair enough. I'll let you dance out of that one. But when is this coming out? You said.
I think it's sometime in September.
Oh, September. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's got like obviously Jackson and Colin, and then Chris
Well, yeah.
from Defiant, and then I think Jody Houser's in there, and Patton Oswalt as well.
Really?
That was in the announcement. This is not any insider information. That was all in the announcement that came out today.
Do these characters all these stories connect to each other?
I don't think so. It's like an anthology, so I think it's just like, you know, different characters at different times. Like the cover has like Spock from the Kelvin universe. Well, I guess that's original Spock, but like that version of Spock. It's got Cisco. It's got Kirk from the first movie from the motion picture. Like it looks like it's plucking from all over the place. So, and I only know about my story. I don't know anybody else's story. So,
When you're ready to talk about it, you can come back on the show.
absolutely, yeah.
All right.
Have me back anytime. I can talk about it.
Thank you so much. Anytime you have anything you want to talk about, come back on. Thank you so
Sure.
much.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Have a great night, sir.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Versus Stars podcast. Please help me battle the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to turn to the next episode when Steve Niles boards the mothership to discuss the God List from Storm King Comics. To the next voyage, travel on.